from Professor Michael Newton, law professor at Vanderbilt University, who is also a leading expert on Kurdish genocide. Welcome.
His Excellency, guests, it's very humbling to follow those remarks because I have little to add of substance that contributes to that. The honor and the sense of pride and the sense of professionalism is thick in this room. I hope you feel it. Thick with the sense of history, thick with the sense of promise for a better future and to learn from the lessons of the past. I have a very few brief comments, and I want to try to put things into focus. In all of my dealings with Iraqi judges and Iraqi lawyers and with Kurds, which began in the mountains of northern Iraq in the immediate aftermath of the war, I've always felt this very strong sense of honor. And I quote a Peshmerga commander who told me one time, honor is real. It's as real as the air you breathe and the food you eat. Very thick, very powerful. And I thank you for that. You've given us that. For the Greeks, the pursuit of justice was the highest virtue of human society. For Greeks, in their culture and their literature, it was all about justice. And that was the highest pursuit to which we could attain as humans. The pursuit to which I've dedicated my professional career, doing justice, trying to right wrongs to the limited extent that we can in the context of trials and reparations and truth and reconciliation commissions. And that's been my career. I still deeply believe that those things have value. I vividly remember one of the victims of Slobodan Milosevic. We had gotten her out, we were interviewing her, and she looked up at me with plaintive eyes. She says, do you think this will ever happen? What is the good? Why am I helping you? And I said, we will prosecute Slobodan Milosevic. Her testimony was later used in that trial. I could give you many, many other examples of Kurdish sacrifice. Halabja, as many of you know, stands as one of the most notable, one of the most widely known instances. People put it into a different context because they say, well, it was a different trial handled in the Iraqi High Tribunal, which it was, as you know, separate from the Anfal case. I could describe for you the reasons for that, but I think it's also an injustice to take Halabja out of that larger context. It's true that it was unlike some of the other acts in the Anfal campaign in the sense that Anfal was primarily directed against residential or rural areas, with large sweeping military operations, and this was an aberration. It was one of the very notable attacks on a large urban population in a very concentrated period of time. It's also notable, of course, for the rumors that there had been contact in the area. I think much disinformation and misinformation that began almost immediately. On March the 22nd, for example, 1988, the first public reporting of Halabja was Peter Jennings on the ABC Evening News, who began to report on Halabja and showed some of the early pictures, but then talked about it in the context of the Iran-Iraq War, completely changing the narrative. And to me, that's one of the great historical problems, is that the historical narrative of what happened on the ground was changed almost from the moment Halabja happened. That's a problem, but it's also a historical reality. As was alluded to by His Excellency, there were more than 50 chemical weapons attacks all across the northern part of Iraq, what was then known as the Northern Bureau. As many of you know, more than 2,000 villages destroyed. I have satellite imagery that we used in the Anfal case of villages before and after. Here's a village on this day. 4 days later, no trace, just scarred, torn earth where villages have been bulldozed under. Concentration camps, Tapsawa, Nugra Salma, incredible human sacrifice, incredible resilience among people, families that bound together. These are the stories of Kurdistan, and I would say these are the larger stories of Iraq. Those are inseparable. That cannot be forgotten. In the instant that Halabja was attacked, the destiny of the place changed forever, and the destiny of those people changed forever. Families were forever changed. College students home on spring break. It's that time of year in America. College students go home on spring break. They were home on spring break in Halabja that morning. nursing mothers. There's one account I've read of a wedding planned that day that was disrupted. Mothers died in some cases, documented in instances of this. Mothers died with babies suckling because they thought, well, if the baby is suckling, then the baby will live. Not true. My wife is doing an advanced degree in psychology. So if you'll permit me to deviate just a little bit, I've learned as much as she has. She comes home from her classes and she psychoanalyzes me. And I've gotten, if you will, sort of a derivative education in psychology and suffering. And so I want to share some thoughts that originated in a discussion with her, and then I went and did my homework. Because I think they're relevant to the larger context of the way we view Halabja, the way we see it today, almost a quarter century later. Psychologists will tell you that when any human being suffers, and I would say this is actually true in a larger sense for a society and for a culture, that when people suffer great things, great trauma, personal loss, great things, that the human reaction, the psychological, almost genetic reaction, is to take two immediate steps. The first is to try to escape it. That's why you see so many people, for example, who have suffered great trauma that try to drown their sorrows in alcohol or drugs. Or they believe, well, I've suffered trauma here, so I will leave. I will move to a different place. I will escape. I will find a new circle of friends. So there's this human flight to try to escape. But we all know in the case of Halabja that there is no escape. We have the pictures. We have the oral histories. We have the trial itself, the investigative judge's report in the actual Halabja case. We have the trial verdict. The history is written. The human suffering is documented. Many of us know and have sat down with survivors who were in the town that day. There is no escape. There is no denial. And I would say that psychologically, it's far healthier not to try to escape. It's far healthier for the culture and for the people to face that, to face the reality, and then make of it what they will. And I'll speak of that in just a second. The second human psychological tendency when we're faced with great trauma and great suffering is to try to explain it away. We try to rationalize, we try to explain, we try to shift blame, we try to say, well, this is what really happened, so let me rationalize. There is no explanation for Halabja, or the larger pattern of Kurdish genocides, I would say. The explanation, the rationalization comes in the body of law to which I've devoted my professional career. The deep, widespread strains of crimes against humanity law that we've developed in the last 2 decades. The law of genocide, the law of war crimes, and the laws and customs of war. All those things, very well documented, very well applied, and now, thanks to the courage of Iraqi judges and Iraqi prosecutors, now, since 2003, implemented in the domestic fabric and the domestic criminal law of Iraq itself. Critically important. And in that sense, Iraq's modern penal code is exactly on a par with those of Australia and Germany and France and every other country in the world. Critically important. So there's no possibility of rationalizing or explaining away. Now we can use the correct term. We can say genocide. And we can have the factual evidence and the legal predicate to support those conclusions in an irrefutable, documented, public way. We can say the crime against humanity of persecution, and we can document it. There is no explanation. There is no rationalization. There is no shifting of responsibility. It's very clear, both in legal terms and in moral terms, what we're talking about. So the psychologists will tell you that we try to explain it, we try to escape it, and then they will tell you those things are unhealthy. They will tell you when you have suffered trauma, what you must do is to embrace it. And they don't mean in the sense of welcoming. And trauma is never welcome. What happened in Halabja has very few redeeming factors. What happened in the larger Kurdish genocide has very few redeeming factors. So I don't mean embrace it in the sense of exalting it. What they tell us to do is to confront things with honesty, to draw the lessons, to try to focus not in accepting and not in acclaiming, but in actualizing the lessons of that suffering, learning from them, applying them, growing from that. And that's certainly true, as His Excellency noted in the case of Halabja itself. It has grown stronger and in some ways better, in some ways richer, in many ways saddened and forever colored, forever changed by that experience. And that's what the psychologist will tell us that it means to embrace something. In the context of the larger lessons of Halabja, today, nearly a quarter century later, I would simply say two things. And I want to read to you. Don't laugh at me as I put my reading glasses on. I didn't have to do this in the old days. I want to read to you from the closing statement of my friend, the prosecutor, in the Vanderbilt Genocide case. And as we embrace the lessons of Halabja, this is the first one that I would point out. Here's what he said. Your honorable court represents the voice of the Iraqi civilization, which says to the world that the law in Iraq will not permit these crimes to go unpunished. These are the crimes of genocide, the crimes against humanity, and the war crimes which were committed against the innocent people of Kurdistan. These crimes were widespread and brutal to the point that they have gone beyond the borders of our country and have been imposed upon the conscience of humankind throughout the world. The Anfal shows to the world, and this is the lesson that I would ask us to embrace as we look to the future of a better and freer Iraq. The Anfal shows to the world that the defendants are former officials who abandoned the most basic, the most important duty of government, which is to protect and ensure the precious lives of its people. As we embrace Halabja, that's the lesson, is that governments everywhere must redouble their efforts to protect and to preserve and to enhance fundamental human rights. Those aren't just words. They're not just nice ideas. It's the impact of law that changes people's lives and allows them to build their families and to go to school and to travel and to become what they can become in their own lives, which in turn makes society a better place. We must embrace that lesson. The second lesson I would just ask us to remember in this frantic, frenzied season of electioneering, go back in time and remember that Halabja, March of 1988. If you go back and look, and I did this, if you go back and look at the reporting at the time, go back and look at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and what you see is George Herbert Walker Bush competing against Bob Dole, and these vicious little, petty little political arguments back and forth. And the domination of the campaign coverage shifted attention from the really important news items of the day. I would say to you, and I would say to our politicians and to our reporters and to our journalists, don't let the truly important things in life and in culture be crowded off by the immediacy and the urgency of the whatever news event happens that day. There are some things that are important. From the journalists. There are some things that are important, and there are some things that are important. And we must, as human beings and as societies and as political officials, keep the focus on what truly matters. Halabja mattered. It mattered then, and it matters now, and I think it directly matters for our future. The English poet Ian Hamilton, one of my favorite writers, said that on the day of battle, the truth lies naked on the battlefield. The following morning, she has got up, put on her uniform, and marched off in the service of her masters. He was exactly right. And to that end, we can never, ever let Halabja, or in context, the larger Kurdish genocide, become a vehicle or become a foil for achieving a particular political purpose or a particular narrow nationalist objective or some tool that somebody uses to serve their own selfish interests. No, Halabja, in a larger sense, belongs to humanity. And the truth of what happened that day in that larger campaign of genocide, in the larger 8 military campaigns that together compose the Anfal, cannot be forgotten. We must remember that truth. We must embrace that truth. We must teach that truth. And I firmly believe one of my larger projects is to preserve that truth, not just for the sake of our own culture and for our own civilizations and for our own governments, but to preserve that truth for those generations that will come after us, so that it can be studied by academics and by scholars and by young lawyers, and I would say by young Kurds. I live in Nashville. I speak with this community. I love that community. They thirst for true understanding, for true enlightenment, for true depth. think we owe that to them. And in a sense, we owe it to the Kurdish people in the larger sense, but in a very concrete sense, we owe that to the Iraqi people. We owe that to the region. We owe that, truly, to everybody in the world who cares about fundamental human dignity and fundamental human rights, to give them the truth of what happened, to document it in a way that can never, ever be forgotten. As you look at these pictures, I simply want to give you a list. These are real names of real people who were in Halabja on March the 16th. Halabja itself is a window into the soul of the larger Kurdish genocide. It's representative, if you will. I gave you just a very few names. As you look at these pictures, think of these names, because they're emblematic. These people, these stories are emblematic of so many others. Space would not give us time to go into all the names and all the stories. That's why I believe we must preserve them in a way that can be archived and can be researched for the sake of history. But as you look at these pictures, think of these names. Hamida, Jamila, Haj Ali Ras, who was 50 at the time of the attack. Saman Muhammad, who was 14 at the time of the attack. Jamila Abdullah was 28. She was an elementary school teacher. And she survived. None of her class survived. Salah, Bahar, Nuri, Nasrullah. Thank you for coming.